On his wedding night, the Duke wasn't holding his bride. He was found clawing the tapestries, screaming he was flying above the clouds, while his insides slowly dissolved from a shimmering green powder. He drank it for passion, but the beetle he swallowed was turning his bedroom into a bloody torture chamber. And the worst part? He wasn't the only one. In the damp dawn of an autumn morning in the year 1393, the heavy oak door leading to the master suite of a prominent French chateau stood as a barrier between the polite society of the court and a scene of absolute pandemonium. Servants and family members had gathered in the stone corridor, their ears pressed against the cold wood, expecting to hear the hushed whispers of morning intimacy or perhaps the heavy silence of exhausted sleep. Instead, the air was filled with a guttural, rhythmic shrieking that sounded less like human pleasure and more like a trapped animal fighting for its life against an unseen predator, prompting the steward to order the door breached with axes. When the wood finally splintered and gave way, the torchlight revealed a tableau that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives, a grotesque inversion of the romantic ideal that the poets of the age so often celebrated. The groom, a young nobleman upon whose shoulders rested the future of two great houses, was not in bed but perched precariously atop a heavy wardrobe, his fingernails digging into the wood as he screamed that the floor had turned to molten lava. He was stark naked, his skin flushed a violent, unnatural crimson, and his eyes were dilated so fully that the blue of his irises had been swallowed by an abyss of terrified black. In the far corner of the room, huddled beneath a pile of velvet robes, the young bride trembled uncontrollably, her face streaked with soot and tears as she gasped for breath in the thick, cloying atmosphere. The air in the chamber was not filled with the scent of rosewater or lavender as tradition dictated, but hung heavy with a pungent, acrid smog that stung the eyes and coated the throat with a bitter residue. An overturned brazier in the center of the room still smoked, the embers feasting on the scattered remains of dried leaves and strange, twisted roots that had been thrown onto the coals in a frantic attempt to summon desire from the ether. This chaotic spectacle was immediately branded by the local bishop as a clear case of demonic possession, a verdict that conveniently shifted the blame away from the families and onto the supernatural forces of darkness. Yet, a more astute observer would have recognized the symptoms not as spiritual warfare, but as acute anticholinergic toxicity, the result of a desperate and clumsy attempt to manipulate human biology with potent neurotoxins. This was a scene repeated in stone fortresses across Europe, where the immense pressure of dynastic responsibility transformed the bridal chamber into a laboratory of deadly experiments. To understand the sheer desperation that drove a rational man to inhale the smoke of poisonous weeds, one must first comprehend the terrifying silence that hung over medieval alliances. A marriage in this era was not merely a union of hearts but a signed treaty between nations or estates, yet the contract remained dangerously invalid until the physical act of consummation occurred. If a groom failed to perform on his wedding night, the consequences were not just personal humiliation but geopolitical catastrophe, potentially voiding dowries, breaking peace agreements, and plunging entire regions back into bloody warfare. The shadow of failure loomed so large that it birthed a specific psychological plague known as the ligature, or the knot, a paralyzing fear that a man's virility had been magically bound by a witch's curse. This anxiety was so pervasive that the church officially recognized it as a valid ground for annulment, creating a feedback loop of terror where the fear of impotence became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Every groom, from the lowliest knight to the King of France, walked toward the bridal bed with the weight of his ancestors on his back, terrified that his body might betray the grand design of his lineage. In the quiet panic of the weeks leading up to the ceremony, the families would often turn away from prayer and toward the shadowy figures who operated on the fringes of medicine and magic. Apothecaries and village wise women found a lucrative trade in whispering promises of pharmacological invincibility, selling concoctions that guaranteed to ignite a fire in even the coldest blood. They offered not just simple spices like pepper or ginger, which were harmless enough, but potent botanical agents that bridged the narrow gap between an aphrodisiac and a lethal poison. The substance burning in the brazier that night in 1393 was likely a crude mixture of henbane and black henbane, plants containing powerful tropane alkaloids capable of severing the mind's tether to reality. The medical doctrine of the time operated on the simplistic belief that desire was a form of heat, and therefore the body needed to be irritated and inflamed to simulate passion. By burning these herbs and sealing the room, the couple had essentially created a gas chamber, inhaling compounds that attacked the central nervous system with ruthless efficiency. As the smoke filled the lungs and entered the bloodstream, the initial effects would have felt deceptively like the surge of power the groom had been promised by the charlatans. His heart rate would have skyrocketed, pounding against his ribs like a war drum, and his body temperature would have spiked, creating a sensation of intense, burning warmth. To a frightened young man, these symptoms of poisoning could easily be mistaken for the onset of a legendary, heroic virility, giving him a momentary and disastrous boost of confidence before the true toxicity took hold. The tragedy of the night lay in the specific side effects of the henbane, which was notorious for inducing a very specific sensation of levitation or flight in those who consumed it. This biochemical trickery explained why the groom believed he was soaring above the clouds, a common hallucination that also fueled the folklore of witches flying on broomsticks. In his delirium, he was no longer a husband in a bedroom but a mythical creature navigating the heavens, completely detached from the terrified woman watching him from the corner. For the bride, the night transformed from a rite of passage into a survival horror, as she watched the men she had just pledged to obey descend into absolute madness. The smoke that made him manic likely made her dizzy and nauseous, blurring her own vision as she tried to comprehend why her husband was clawing at the tapestries as if they were enemies. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that neither of them understood they were victims of a chemical overdose. They believed they were living through a supernatural event, validating every superstition they had ever been taught. When the servants finally subdued the raving groom and dragged him to a different chamber to be bled by the physicians, the cover-up began almost instantly to protect the family name. The official story would speak of a sudden fever or a passing bout of exhaustion, burying the truth of the toxic smoke and the herbal inducement deep in the family archives. But the incident at the French chateau was merely one drop in an ocean of similar silent calamities, a testament to a time when the desperate quest to engineer love chemically resulted in nights that were indeed unforgettable, though for all the wrong reasons. To comprehend the sheer scale of the hysteria that gripped the medieval bedchamber, one must first look past the romanticized veils of chivalry and gaze into the terrifying silence that hung over these high-stakes unions. In the modern world, intimacy is a private affair guarded by locked doors and social discretion, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, the concept of privacy was practically non-existent for the ruling classes. A royal or noble wedding was not merely a celebration of love, it was the physical ratification of a geopolitical treaty, a contract written in ink but signed in blood upon the linen sheets of the marriage bed. The pressure placed upon a young groom, often no older than 14 or 15, was crushing enough to shatter the strongest constitution, for the entire stability of a region could hinge on his physiological performance during a single hour. When two rival duchies agreed to end a generation of bloodshed through marriage, the peace was only theoretical until the union was consummated, leaving the treaty in a dangerous state of limbo that could be exploited by enemies. If the sun rose the next morning and the sheets remained pristine, the carefully negotiated alliances would dissolve instantly, potentially sending thousands of soldiers back to the muddy battlefields to die for a failure that occurred between silken pillows. This reality transformed the bridal suite into a stage for a high-stakes performance where the audience, though physically absent from the room, was palpably present in the minds of the terrified couple. The groom knew that outside the heavy oak doors, fathers, uncles, bishops, and ambassadors were often pacing the corridors, waiting for the signal that the deed was done and the lineage was secure. Under such immense psychological weight, the body's natural responses often faltered, creating a biological paradox where the desperate need to perform caused the very dysfunction that made performance impossible. It was in this gap between duty and biology that the insidious fear of the supernatural began to take root, growing like black mold in the damp corners of the medieval imagination. When a healthy young man, capable in all other aspects of life, found himself unable to function on his wedding night, the medieval mind did not look to anxiety or stress for an explanation, but rather to the malicious intervention of dark forces. This specific form of magical sabotage was known across Europe as the ligature, or the knot, a curse so feared that it appeared in legal texts and theological treatises as a genuine threat to the sacrament of marriage. The belief in the ligature was pervasive, transcending social barriers to haunt the nightmares of illiterate serfs and educated monarchs alike, binding them in a shared fraternity of paranoia. The mechanics of the curse were terrifyingly simple in the popular imagination. A witch or a jealous rival would tie a knot in a cord or a strip of leather while reciting an incantation, and as the knot tightened, so too would the groom's virility be constricted. It was believed that as long as the physical knot remained tied, hidden somewhere in a mattress or buried under a threshold, the victim would remain spiritually and physically barred from procreation. This superstition created an atmosphere of intense suspicion during weddings, where every guest was a potential saboteur and every strange glance was interpreted as the casting of a hex. Families would go to absurd lengths to protect the groom, sewing holy relics into his undergarments or forcing the couple to step over sanctioned amulets before entering the bedroom. Yet, the more they ritualized the protection, the more they reinforced the reality of the threat, turning the wedding night into a battlefield where the enemy was invisible and the weapons were impotence and shame. The terror was compounded by the fact that the Church, the ultimate authority in all matters of life and death, officially recognized this magical interference as a tangible reality. Theologians argued that since God allowed the devil to test the faithful, it was entirely possible for demons to obstruct the physical act of marriage through the agency of wicked sorcerers. By validating the fear, the Church inadvertently poured fuel on the fire, transforming what might have been a temporary moment of nervousness into a spiritual crisis that required ecclesiastical intervention. When a marriage failed to be consummated, the consequences were not merely gossip or social awkwardness, they involved a humiliating and invasive legal process that could strip a man of his dignity and his titles. If the wife claimed that her husband was impotent, the Church could convene a court to determine the validity of the marriage, a proceeding that was as clinical as it was degrading. These trials became public spectacles where the intimate details of the bedroom were dissected by a panel of clerics and lawyers, forcing the groom to describe his failures in excruciating detail before a solemn tribunal. In some of the most extreme and notorious cases, the ecclesiastical courts would order a physical inspection, a procedure that stands as one of the most mortifying ordeals in legal history. A panel of matrons or midwives would be tasked with examining the groom to determine if he was physically capable of the act, prodding and measuring him like a prize hog at a market fair. If this examination proved inconclusive, the court might demand a trial by Congress, where the couple was ordered to attempt consummation again, this time with witnesses or experts listening just outside the curtains to verify the attempt. The horror of such a public exposure was a fate worse than death for a proud nobleman, for it destroyed not only his own reputation but cast a shadow of weakness over his entire bloodline. A man declared impotent was often viewed as less than a man, a broken vessel rejected by God and nature, unfit to lead armies or govern lands. It was this terrifying prospect of legal and social annihilation that drove rational men to abandon the safety of prayer and seek salvation in the shadows of the black market. In the face of such overwhelming odds, the local apothecary or the village wise woman ceased to be a figure of suspicion and transformed into a potential savior holding the keys to redemption. These practitioners existed on the fringes of acceptable society, tolerating the scorn of the clergy during the day while catering to the desperate needs of the faithful under the cover of darkness. They understood that when a man is faced with the destruction of his legacy, he cares very little for the morality of the cure, provided it delivers the desired result before the morning bell tolls. The trade in these illicit enhancements was a thriving underground economy, fueled by the whisper network of servants and pages who knew exactly which door to knock on when the master was in distress. The apothecary's shop was a sensory assault, a cramped space filled with the dust of dried herbs and the metallic tang of minerals, where the air was thick with the promise of forbidden knowledge. Here, amidst jars of pickled vipers and bundles of dried sage, the desperate groom could purchase hope in a small glass vial, no questions asked and no judgments passed. These vendors of vigor did not sell their wares as mere supplements, but as powerful alchemical agents capable of overriding the body's natural limitations and defeating the witch's knot. They spoke in hushed tones of ingredients sourced from the exotic East or harvested from the gallows at midnight, weaving a narrative of potency that was as intoxicating as the drugs themselves. The transaction was often conducted in a hurried panic, with heavy bags of silver coins exchanged for a pinch of powder or a murky liquid that smelled of earth and decay. The promise was always the same, a potion that would ignite a fire in the coldest blood and turn a trembling, frightened youth into a creature of tireless, predatory stamina. They preyed on the insecurity of the age, assuring the buyer that the burning sensation in the gut or the racing of the heart was not a sign of poisoning, but the awakening of a dormant, heroic strength. For a man terrified of the morning's shame, the risk of drinking an unknown concoction seemed trivial compared to the certainty of the humiliation that awaited him if he did nothing. This desperation blinded them to the obvious danger of consuming unregulated toxins, for the medieval understanding of biology was a chaotic mix of humors and elements that left little room for caution. The prevailing medical theory held that the body was a vessel of fluids that needed to be balanced or agitated, and if the heat of passion was lacking, it had to be artificially introduced. Thus, the burning agony caused by caustic substances was misinterpreted as the successful rekindling of the vital spark, a tragic error that would lead many to their doom. The sellers of these wares were often walking a razor's edge themselves, knowing that if their potion killed a nobleman, they would be dragged to the pyre as poisoners or witches. Yet the potential profits were astronomical, for a single successful wedding night could earn a healer more gold than a lifetime of curing coughs and setting broken bones. This financial incentive drove them to experiment with increasingly volatile ingredients, pushing the boundaries of toxicity in search of the ultimate aphrodisiac that could guarantee an heir. As the wedding season approached, the demand for these preparations would spike, and the apothecaries would work late into the night, grinding roots and mixing pastes in a grim parody of culinary preparation. They were the silent partners in the dynastic wars of Europe, the architects of history who worked not with treaties and swords, but with mortars and pestles. They knew that the fate of kingdoms often rested not on the battlefield, but on the outcome of a single night, and they were more than willing to provide the chemical ammunition required to win the war of the bedchamber. Thus, the stage was set for a tragedy of errors, where the fear of a magical curse led to the embrace of a very real chemical danger. The groom, paralyzed by the fear of the ligature and the judgment of the church, became a willing participant in his own poisoning, drinking down the bitter draught in the hope of salvation. He did not know that the fire he was buying was often the first symptom of a systemic collapse, a burning fuse that would lead to an explosion of madness and pain in the sanctity of the bridal suite. In this high-pressure cooker of expectations, superstition, and bad science, the wedding night ceased to be a human experience and became a desperate medical procedure. The joy of union was replaced by the terror of performance, and the gentle touch of a lover was swapped for the harsh kick of a hallucinogen. It was a recipe for disaster written in the stars and sealed in a vial, waiting only for the cork to be pulled to unleash its chaotic potential upon the unsuspecting lovers. To step inside the pharmacopoeia of a medieval bedchamber is to enter a realm where the line between healing and homicide was not merely blurred but often entirely erased. This was not a collection of gentle supplements or benign vitamins, but a terrifying arsenal of biological weapons that had been repurposed for the delicate art of love. The shelves of the apothecary, hidden away from the prying eyes of the church, groaned under the weight of jars filled with dried roots, crushed insects, and powders derived from the most toxic plants known to botany. These substances were marketed as miracles, but in reality, they were poisons masking as medicines, sold to desperate men who were willing to risk their lives for a single night of chemically induced vigor. The foundation of this dangerous trade was built upon a medical doctrine that was as simplistic as it was perilous, rooted in the ancient understanding of the four bodily humors. Medieval physicians and healers operated under the firm belief that sexual desire was fundamentally a manifestation of heat, a fiery energy that boiled within the blood and drove the body toward procreation. Conversely, impotence and lethargy were viewed as symptoms of a cold and damp constitution, a freezing of the spirit that required an immediate and aggressive thaw. Therefore, the logic followed that to cure a flagging libido, one had to introduce substances that would physically irritate the body, provoking a reaction that could be mistaken for the heat of passion. This philosophy of irritation led the wealthy and the powerful to first turn their eyes toward the spice trade, spending absolute fortunes on exotic ingredients imported from the distant East. In the great banquet halls of France and Italy, the consumption of pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and ginger was not merely a culinary preference but a medicinal strategy designed to prime the body for the night ahead. These spices were worth their weight in gold, quite literally, and their presence on the wedding table was a public declaration of both financial power and intent. The burning sensation these spices caused on the tongue and in the stomach was interpreted as the awakening of the vital fires, a physiological signal that the internal furnace was being stoked. For the aristocracy, the use of nutmeg was particularly fashionable, as it was rumored to possess narcotic properties that could lower inhibitions and induce a pleasant, floating stupor. This was not entirely a myth, as nutmeg contains myristicin, a compound that in large enough doses can act as a psychoactive deliriant, though the line between a pleasant buzz and a sickening toxicity was razor-thin. Families would grate precious nuts into chalices of heavy wine, serving the groom a cocktail that was essentially a mild stimulant mixed with a depressant, hoping to relax his nerves while simultaneously irritating his digestive tract. It was a clumsy attempt at biochemistry, but for many, the psychological boost of consuming something so rare and expensive was enough to produce a placebo effect. However, when the stakes were maximally high and the groom's constitution proved resistant to the gentle warming of peppers and cloves, the healers would reach for the heavy artillery of the plant kingdom. This was where the true danger lay, in the family of Solanaceae, or nightshades, a group of plants that included some of the most potent neurotoxins found in nature. Henbane, mandrake, and datura were the dark stars of this collection, plants that had been associated with witchcraft and sorcery for centuries before they found their way into the wedding suite. These were not food, nor were they flavorings, they were biological keys capable of unlocking, and often breaking, the delicate machinery of the human nervous system. Henbane, with its sticky, hairy leaves and foul smell, was a particular favorite among those seeking to induce a state of delirious stamina, despite its reputation as a plant of the dead. It contains hyoscyamine and scopolamine, alkaloids that block the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, effectively cutting off the body's parasympathetic nervous system. When ingested or absorbed, henbane does not create true desire, but rather a state of confused excitation, characterized by a rapid heartbeat, dilated pupils, and a flushed, hot skin that mimics the flush of arousal. A groom under the influence of henbane might feel a surge of chaotic energy and a disconnection from reality, allowing him to perform mechanical acts without the interference of anxiety or even conscious thought. Even more steeped in legend and dread was the mandrake root, a plant whose bifurcated root system often resembled the shape of a human body, complete with limbs and a head. This visual similarity led to the doctrine of signatures, a belief that God had marked plants with a physical sign indicating their use, and thus the mandrake was seen as the ultimate cure for issues of the human form. The harvesting of mandrake was surrounded by elaborate rituals involving ivory stakes and black dogs, myths designed to drive up the price and mystique of a root that was, in essence, a powerful hallucinogen. When a groom consumed a potion laced with mandrake, he was inviting a powerful delirium that could bridge the gap between wakefulness and dream, turning the bedroom into a landscape of shifting shadows and vivid fantasies. Yet, the most infamous and destructive agent in the medieval aphrodisiac arsenal was not a plant at all, but a shimmering, emerald green beetle known to history as the Spanish fly. Scientifically known as Lytta vesicatoria, this insect was ground into a fine powder and served as the ultimate solution for the most intractable cases of impotence, a nuclear option for the desperate. The mechanism of action for Spanish fly was not hormonal or psychological, it was brutally physical, relying on a toxic compound called cantharidin that the beetle produced to defend itself from predators. This was no love potion, but a blistering agent, a chemical so caustic that it would burn skin upon contact and destroy delicate internal tissues if swallowed. When a man ingested a draught containing crushed Spanish fly, the cantharidin would pass through his system, eventually concentrating in the urine as the body desperately tried to expel the poison. As the toxin moved through the urinary tract, it caused severe chemical burns and acute inflammation of the urethra, leading to swelling and engorgement that superficially resembled a lasting erection. This was the cruel irony of the Spanish fly. The physical sign of virility that the groom so desperately sought was actually a symptom of his body's agonizing reaction to a lethal irritant. The passion he felt was, in reality, the burning pain of his own tissues inflaming, a sensation that could easily escalate into permanent kidney damage or a slow, bleeding death. The horror of these practices was compounded by the complete lack of standardization in the preparation of these potent mixtures, turning every dose into a game of Russian roulette. There were no precise scales, no purity tests, and no regulatory bodies to ensure that a pinch of henbane in one village was the same strength as a pinch in another. A root harvested in the damp spring might be twice as potent as one dug up in the dry autumn, yet the recipes remained vague, relying on the intuition of the apothecary rather than the precision of science. A handful of leaves or a thumb's worth of root could mean the difference between a night of wild hallucinations and a mourning funeral, and the groom was the unwitting test subject in this chaotic experiment. These concoctions were rarely taken pure, instead, they were mixed into sweet, heavy wines or masked with honey and spices to hide the bitter, acrid taste of the toxins. The alcohol served a dual purpose, acting as a solvent to extract the alkaloids from the plant matter while also providing the groom with a veil of liquid courage. However, the combination of alcohol and depressants like scopolamine created a dangerous synergy, depressing the respiratory system while simultaneously sending the heart into a frantic, arrhythmic gallop. It was not uncommon for a groom to collapse into a coma shortly after his triumph, his body overwhelmed by the chemical assault it had sustained in the name of duty. Perhaps even more insidious than the oral potions were the topical preparations, the oils and salves that were instructed to be rubbed directly onto the skin or the most sensitive parts of the anatomy. Medieval medicine understood that the skin was a barrier, but they also knew that certain substances could pass through it, especially when mixed with animal fats like goose grease or boar lard. These flying ointments, as they were sometimes called in the context of witchcraft, allowed the toxins to bypass the stomach and enter the bloodstream directly, hitting the nervous system with terrifying speed. Applying a salve of henbane and nightshade to the mucous membranes resulted in an almost instantaneous absorption, causing a rush of dizziness and hallucination that hit the groom like a physical blow. The use of these transdermal poisons meant that the bride, too, was often an unintended victim of the groom's desperation, exposed to the toxins through contact during the act of consummation. If a groom had slathered himself in an ointment of Spanish fly or henbane, the friction of the wedding night would transfer the blistering agents and hallucinogens to her as well. She might find herself suffering from chemical burns or descending into a shared delirium, her own senses warping under the influence of the drugs that coated her husband's skin. This shared poisoning was frequently misinterpreted as a mutual spiritual ecstasy, a divine sign that the marriage was blessed, when in fact it was a mutual intoxication. The apothecaries who mixed these salves worked in the shadows, often grinding the ingredients in the same mortars used for rat poison and medicinal cures, leading to accidental cross-contamination. A speck of aconite or a residue of arsenic left in the bowl could turn a standard aphrodisiac into a swift-acting execution method, adding yet another layer of risk to the proceedings. The groom, trusting in the wisdom of the healer, would apply these unguents with hope in his heart, unaware that he was essentially painting himself with venom. The tingling sensation was welcomed as the magic taking hold, the numbness as a sign of endurance, until the moment the body's systems began to shut down one by one. It is a testament to the immense pressure of the era that men continued to seek out these remedies despite the well-known stories of those who had died foaming at the mouth or screaming at invisible demons. The fear of being branded a failure, of ending a lineage, was so overpowering that the prospect of death seemed a reasonable wager against the certainty of shame. They drank the murky green wines and rubbed the burning pastes into their flesh, offering themselves up as sacrifices on the altar of fertility. In their quest to conquer biology, they became willing participants in a dark alchemy, turning the bridal bed into a testing ground for the limits of human toxicity. Ultimately, the pharmacopoeia of the medieval bedroom was a reflection of a world where nature was seen as a force to be dominated and coerced, regardless of the cost to the human vessel. The reliance on these poisons reveals a profound anxiety that permeated the ruling classes, a terror that their natural bodies were insufficient for the supernatural weight of their responsibilities. So they turned to the roots and the beetles, the nightshades and the blistering agents, hoping to borrow the chaotic power of the earth to secure their futures. And in doing so, they ensured that for many, the wedding night was not a beginning, but a delirious, painful, and sometimes fatal end. As the heavy, resinous smoke of the burnt herbs settled into the stone-cold corners of the bridal chamber, or as the last dregs of the spiked wine were drained from the chalice, the atmosphere in the room would undergo a radical and terrifying shift. The initial silence of awkward anticipation was shattered not by the gentle whispers of intimacy, but by the sudden, chemical hijacking of the groom's central nervous system. The transition was rarely smooth, it was a violent kick, a rapid descent into a pharmacological chaos that dissolved the boundaries of the physical world. The groom, sitting on the edge of the bed or pacing the floor, would suddenly find that the ground beneath his feet had ceased to be a solid object, replaced by a shifting, liquid instability that defied the laws of physics. This sensation of unmooring was the hallmark signature of the tropane alkaloids found in henbane, mandrake, and deadly nightshade, specifically the compounds scopolamine and atropine. These powerful neurotoxins attack the vestibular system, the delicate mechanism within the inner ear that governs balance and spatial orientation. As the poison flooded the brain's receptors, it severed the link between the body's position and the mind's perception of it, creating a vivid and undeniable sensation of weightlessness. To the intoxicated groom, the heavy oak floorboards seemed to drop away entirely, leaving him suspended in an invisible ether, a phenomenon that would lead to centuries of folklore regarding witches flying on broomsticks. In the candlelight of the bedchamber, this chemically induced levitation was often interpreted by the delirious subject not as a medical emergency, but as a spiritual or magical ascension. The groom, clutching the bedposts to keep himself from floating up to the raftered ceiling, might scream out in a mixture of terror and exhilaration that he was soaring above the castle turrets. He believed he was looking down upon the sleeping countryside, his spirit untethered from his mortal coil, engaging in a flight that felt more real to him than the stone walls he was actually bouncing off. This was the ecstasy that the apothecaries had promised, a literal standing outside of oneself, though it had nothing to do with sexual pleasure and everything to do with vestibular failure. The tragedy of this delusion was how it was perceived by the hopeful or anxious listeners pressing their ears to the heavy wooden doors in the corridor outside. The thuds of the groom crashing into furniture and his cries of amazement were frequently misdiagnosed as the sounds of a vigorous and heroic consummation. The court, desperate for a successful union, projected their own desires onto the cacophony, crafting legends of the groom's superhuman prowess. They did not know that the man they were envying was currently clinging to a tapestry, convinced that he was gripping the mane of a Pegasus, his mind completely divorced from the carnal act he was supposed to be performing. Inside the room, the physical reality of the groom's condition was far more grotesque than the romanticized rumors would suggest, particularly evident in his eyes. One of the most prominent side effects of anticholinergic poisoning is extreme mydriasis, the dilation of the pupils until the iris is virtually invisible. The groom's eyes would transform into two gaping black voids, swallowing the candlelight and giving him a demonic, predatory appearance that terrified the bride. This dilation let in agonizing amounts of light, causing the flickering candles to flare with the intensity of supernovas, further distorting his visual field and feeding the hallucinations that were beginning to populate the room. These hallucinations were not vague shadows or tricks of the light, they were complex, fully formed deliriums that overlaid the real world with a tapestry of the absurd. The brain, flooded with dopamine and stripped of its ability to filter sensory input, began to generate its own reality based on the subconscious fears and cultural programming of the individual. A groom raised on the stories of chivalry and religious crusade might see the bridal bed not as a place of rest, but as a besieged altar guarded by seraphim. He might begin to converse with these invisible entities, his voice oscillating between the guttural growl of a warrior and the weeping supplication of a penitent, leaving the bride to watch in bewildered horror. The visual distortions frequently morphed inanimate objects into living threats or allies, turning the familiar comforts of the bedroom into a theater of war. The embroidered hunters on the heavy velvet curtains might seem to step down from the fabric, their hounds baying silently as they circled the room. The shadows cast by the furniture stretched and twisted into dragons or Saracen warriors, forcing the groom to engage in phantom combat to protect his honor. He might lunge at empty air, swinging an invisible sword, or cower behind a chest to shield himself from arrows that existed only in his firing synapses, effectively turning the wedding night into a solitary chaotic crusade. For the bride, often a teenage girl with little life experience and no knowledge of toxicology, this transformation of her husband was a source of profound psychological trauma. She was trapped in a confined space with a man who looked like her betrothed but acted like a stranger possessed by legions of spirits. She was forced to endure his manic energy, his nonsensical ramblings, and his erratic movements, unsure if he was about to embrace her or attack her as one of his hallucinated foes. The man she had married was no longer present in the room. In his place was a vessel animated by toxins, a puppet jerking on the strings of a chemical storm that had completely hijacked his faculties. To the bride, watching from the corner or pressed against the cold stone of the wall, he appeared not as a lover but as a creature possessed, his movements jerky and unpredictable, lacking the fluid grace of human intention. One moment he might be staring catatonically at the flame of a candle, mesmerized by the dancing light, and the next he might be tearing at his own clothes as if they were burning his skin, a symptom of the intense hyperthermia that often accompanied nightshade poisoning. This chaotic behavior was frequently misinterpreted by the hopeful court outside as the manifestation of an unbridled, virile passion, the sounds of crashing furniture and incoherent shouting taken as evidence of a vigorous consummation. The heavy tapestries and thick oak doors muffled the specifics of the terror inside, filtering the screams of confusion into a low, rhythmic thrum that the listeners chose to identify as pleasure. They did not hear the groom begging an invisible executioner for mercy or shouting at the ceiling to stop spinning, they heard only the volume of the noise, and in the crude calculus of medieval masculinity, volume was equated with performance. The disconnect between the groom's internal reality and his physical actions created a scenario of extreme danger for the bride, who was often physically smaller and completely unprepared for violence. Under the influence of henbane and datura, the body's pain receptors are dampened, and the natural inhibitors that prevent a person from using their full muscular strength are stripped away. The groom, believing he was wrestling a bear or holding up a collapsing roof, would exert a manic, hysterical strength that he could neither control nor comprehend, turning a simple embrace into a crushing grip that left bruises in the shape of fingerprints. In his delirious mind, the act of lovemaking was often conflated with the acts of fighting or fleeing, the biological drive for procreation becoming tangled with the primal instinct for survival. He might approach the bridal bed not with tenderness, but with the aggression of a soldier breaching a castle wall, his movements driven by a neurochemical command to conquer and subdue. The bride became an object in his hallucination, perhaps a damsel to be saved or a demon to be vanquished, her own cries of pain or protest failing to penetrate the thick wall of his psychosis. The physiological effects of the herbs further compounded the horror, specifically the severe dryness of the mouth and throat known as xerostomia, a classic sign of atropine poisoning. As the groom tried to speak or whisper endearments, his voice would emerge as a dry, rasping croak, his tongue swollen and sticking to the roof of his mouth like a piece of rough leather. This inability to articulate added to his panic and agitation, transforming his attempts at communication into guttural, animalistic noises that bore no resemblance to human speech, further fueling the bride's belief that she was trapped with a beast. The sensory distortion was absolute. The groom's skin, hot and dry as parchment, would flush a brilliant scarlet, radiating a feverish heat that felt unnatural to the touch. This atropine flush was often mistaken by the couple for the heat of passion, a physical confirmation that the aphrodisiac was working its magic on the blood. In reality, it was the body's desperate attempt to shed heat as the sweat glands were paralyzed by the toxin, a dangerous physiological state that brought the groom to the brink of heatstroke even in the cool draft of a stone castle. As the night wore on and the dosage reached its peak, the groom's coordination would begin to fail spectacularly, turning the bedroom into a landscape of slapstick tragedy. He might lunge for the bed and miss entirely, crashing onto the floor with a force that would have stunned a sober man, yet he would scramble up instantly, driven by the relentless motor agitation of the drug. He might try to pour wine and end up mimicking the motion with an empty hand, or attempt to walk through a door that was clearly closed, bouncing off the wood with a bewildered look on his face. For the bride, this was a test of endurance that required a steely resolve, forcing her to navigate a situation where the rules of social interaction had been suspended. She had to manage a man who was simultaneously incredibly strong and pathetically helpless, a husband who might try to strangle her one moment and then curl up in a fetal position and weep for his mother the next. Her role shifted rapidly from lover to nursemaid to jailer, all while maintaining the silence required to preserve the honor of the families involved, knowing that a cry for help would be an admission of a disastrous failure. The flying sensation described by so many survivors was not merely a mental illusion but a proprioceptive collapse, where the brain lost track of the limbs in space. The groom might feel that his legs were 10 feet long or that his hands had swelled to the size of hams, making the simple mechanics of undressing or touching impossible. He might grasp at the air, believing he was holding his wife's hand, while she stood 5 feet away, watching him caress the empty void with a look of rapturous devotion that was entirely misplaced. This dissociation meant that any successful consummation that did occur was often a mechanical, joyless act, performed by a body on autopilot while the mind was traversing a distant galaxy. The groom would have no memory of the intimacy the next day, his recollection wiped clean by the amnesic properties of the scopolamine, leaving a blank spot in the narrative of his marriage. He would wake up bruised and exhausted, relying entirely on the testimony of his wife or the evidence of the sheets to know if he had fulfilled his dynastic duty, a hollow victory bought at the price of his consciousness. The hallucinations could take a darker, more paranoid turn, especially if the groom had underlying anxieties about the marriage or the political alliance it represented. The friendly faces in the paintings might turn into judging ancestors, their eyes following him with disapproval, feeding the deep-seated fear of the ligature that had driven him to the drugs in the first place. He might become convinced that there was an assassin in the room, perhaps even suspecting the terrified girl in the corner of being a witch sent to steal his soul, leading to outbursts of accusatory violence. In this theater of the absurd, time lost all meaning, minutes stretched into hours and hours compressed into seconds, the night becoming an endless loop of recurring delusions. The groom might relive the same moment of entering the room over and over again, trapping the bride in a cycle of repetitive, nonsensical behavior that wore down her mental defenses. She was forced to be the anchor in his storm, the only point of reality in a world that had dissolved into swirling colors and impossible geometries, a burden that no young woman was prepared to bear. The tragedy was that this state of delirium was exactly what the apothecary had sold as the ultimate experience, a total liberation from the inhibitions of the self. By destroying the ego and the rational mind, the drugs certainly removed the anxiety of performance, but they replaced it with a psychotic break that made performance irrelevant. The flight of the groom was a flight from humanity, a regression to a state of pure, chemically driven instinct where love, duty, and consent were concepts that no longer existed. As the candles burned down to their nubs and the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the arrow slits, the manic energy would often give way to a sudden, crushing lethargy. The neurotransmitters, depleted and blocked, would finally surrender, and the groom would collapse wherever he stood, falling into a stupor that was closer to a coma than true sleep. He would lie amidst the wreckage of the room, overturned chairs, torn curtains, spilled wine, looking like the casualty of a battle, which, in a very real biological sense, he was. The bride, exhausted and traumatized, would be left to survey the damage, listening to the shallow, ragged breathing of her husband and praying that he would wake up as the men she knew. She would have to compose herself, smooth her dress, and prepare to face the influx of servants and family members who would soon arrive to inspect the scene. She knew she would have to smile and confirm the success of the night, burying the truth of the chaos under a veneer of modest satisfaction, becoming the keeper of a secret that would fester in the heart of the marriage for years to come. Thus, the unforgettable night promised by the herbalists was indeed etched into memory, but as a nightmare of confusion and fear rather than a dream of passion. The groom had flown, yes, but he had flown into a hurricane, and the wreckage he left behind was the foundation upon which a dynasty would be built. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval pursuit of power and legacy, the human element was often the first thing to be sacrificed, dissolved in a cup of wine and smoke, leaving behind only the raw, ugly mechanics of survival. The boundary between a night of legendary passion and a morning of tragic silence was often measured in the most minute and unforgiving of increments, sometimes no more than a few stray grains of a crushed root or leaf. In the damp, dimly lit laboratories where these concoctions were prepared, the concept of standardized dosage was a futuristic dream, completely alien to a world that measured potency by the pinch, the thumb, or the handful. A root harvested during a wet spring might contain half the alkaloid concentration of the same plant dug up during a dry summer, yet the recipe remained lethally constant, relying on tradition rather than titration. This botanical roulette meant that a groom drinking the exact same potion that had invigorated his father might find himself consuming a dose that was not merely stimulating, but cataclysmically toxic to the human heart. The history of medieval nuptials is thus a graveyard of silent calamities, a landscape dotted with young men who sought to be heroes of the bedchamber and ended up as casualties of their own insecurity. The margin for error when working with substances like aconite, hemlock, and concentrated nightshade is terrifyingly narrow, and the medieval digestive system was often the only laboratory where the final testing took place. A servant's trembling hand adding just a fraction too much powder to the wine, or an apothecary trying to ensure satisfaction by doubling the strength of a mixture, could instantly transform a celebration of life into a wake. The grim reality was that the difference between an erection and a cardiac arrest was often invisible to the naked eye, hidden within the cellular structure of a dried plant. Court chronicles and official genealogies are meticulously sanitized documents, written to preserve the dignity of noble houses, and so they maintain a disciplined silence regarding the true cause of these sudden, convenient deaths. They speak of sudden fevers, mysterious apoplexies, or the inscrutable will of God taking a young lord in his prime, carefully avoiding any mention of the green sludge found in the bottom of his goblet. Yet, if one reads between the lines of these dusty parchments, a pattern emerges of healthy men dropping dead at their own wedding feasts or being found cold and stiff on the first morning of their married lives. These were not deaths of natural causes but cases of acute poisoning, self-administered in a frantic bid to live up to the impossible standards of dynastic virility. There were instances where the tragedy struck before the couple even reached the privacy of the bridal suite, unfolding publicly and horrifically in the midst of the wedding banquet itself. The groom, having predosed himself in anticipation of the night ahead, would be sitting at the high table, perhaps flushed and sweating, a state attributed by the guests to the heavy wine and the roaring hearths. But as the toxins, particularly the cardiotoxic compounds found in plants like lily of the valley or foxglove, began to accumulate in his bloodstream, the internal pressure would reach a breaking point. The festivities would be brought to a screeching halt as the lord of the manor suddenly clutched his chest, his eyes rolling back into his head as he collapsed onto the trenchers of roasted meats. The scene that followed was often interpreted through the lens of superstition or religion, but medically, it was a textbook example of a chemically induced seizure or heart failure. Guests would watch in frozen horror as the groom convulsed on the rushes, foam frothing at the corners of his mouth, a sign of pulmonary edema or the body's violent rejection of the poison. To the medieval observer, this looked suspiciously like demonic possession or a curse taking hold, leading to immediate screams for a priest rather than a physician. The froth, often tinged with blood, was not the result of a spell but the physical manifestation of a nervous system that had been overstimulated to the point of total collapse, a biological engine tearing itself apart from the inside. However, the more common and perhaps more chilling scenario played out in the claustrophobic silence of the bedchamber, behind doors that were locked and barred against the outside world. Here, the groom would die in the dark, his heart exploding under the dual strain of physical exertion and the relentless chemical whipping of the stimulants. The tragedy of these deaths lay in their timing. The very moment of intended triumph became the moment of terminal failure, as the heart, driven to beat at a frantic, unnatural rhythm, simply gave out. The ecstasy that the groom experienced in his final moments was likely the hypoxic euphoria of a dying brain, a final, cruel hallucination before the darkness took him completely. Imagine the horror of the bride, often a young stranger to this man, who might have mistaken his sudden collapse for the exhaustion of sleep or a strange quirk of intimacy. She would lie there in the darkness, waiting for a movement or a word, slowly realizing that the heavy weight pressing down on the mattress was no longer a living person but a corpse. The discovery would usually come with the first light of dawn, when the gray illumination revealed the blue tint of his lips and the fixed, glassy stare of eyes that would never blink again. The scream that eventually tore through the castle was not one of consummation, but of a terror so profound it would echo through the stone corridors for generations. When the chamber doors were finally broken down by anxious kin, the scene that greeted them sparked an immediate and ruthless panic that had little to do with grief and everything to do with self-preservation. A dead groom meant a voided treaty, a dowry in limbo, and a potential war with the bride's family, creating a power vacuum that had to be filled instantly with a plausible narrative. The truth, that the Lord had overdosed on illicit aphrodisiacs, was politically unacceptable, as it implied weakness, infertility, and a shameful reliance on witchcraft. Therefore, the machinery of the court would instantly spring into action to manufacture a lie that protected the honor of the dead man while finding a scapegoat for his demise. In this high-stakes game of blame, the bride was often the most convenient and vulnerable target, especially if she came from a rival house or a foreign land. It was dangerously easy to twist the narrative, claiming that she had used the privacy of the bedroom to slip poison to her husband, perhaps out of loyalty to her own family or a secret hatred for the match. The foam at the mouth, and the convulsed limbs, symptoms of his self-poisoning, were presented as irrefutable evidence of a malicious toxin administered by a treacherous hand. Thus, the victim of the trauma became the villain of the story, accused of murder to cover up the embarrassing reality of a botched biological experiment. These accusations frequently led to swift and brutal justice, with the grieving widow imprisoned in a tower or, in darker cases, subjected to the question by inquisitors seeking a confession of witchcraft. If the marriage had been politically unpopular, the death of the groom provided the perfect excuse to eliminate the bride as well, using the charge of poisoning to sever the alliance cleanly. She would be branded a black widow, a woman whose touch was deadly, a reputation that would follow her to the grave, masking the fact that her only crime was surviving a night where her husband had not. The irony was palpable: she was punished for his failure, executed for a murder he had committed against himself. If the family could not, or would not, blame the bride, the wrath of the court would turn inevitably toward the supply chain, targeting the apothecaries and wise women who had provided the substances. These shadowy figures, who had been paid handsomely in gold only days before, were now dragged from their shops in chains, accused of sorcery and malevolent intent. The logic was twisted but effective: the groom had not sought a sexual aid, he had been bewitched or ensnared by a practitioner of the dark arts who had sought to destroy the noble bloodline. This narrative shifted the agency away from the groom entirely, painting him as a pure, innocent victim of a magical assault rather than a desperate man seeking a chemical fix. The fires that consumed these witches and poisoners served a dual purpose: they satisfied the public's need for vengeance and they conveniently destroyed the only witnesses who knew the truth. When the apothecary burned, the recipe burned with him, and the secret transaction that had taken place in the back of the shop was reduced to ash and smoke. The family could then stand pious and aggrieved, mourning their loss while ensuring that no one would ever know the Lord had died with his pockets full of dried Spanish fly and mandrake root. It was a brutal form of reputation management, written in the charred flesh of those who had only provided exactly what was asked of them. The terror of the poisoned wedding night became a staple of folklore, a cautionary tale that warned against the dangers of foreign brides and dark magic, completely missing the true lesson about unregulated pharmacology. The stories would be embellished over time, adding demons and curses, drifting further and further away from the simple, tragic medical facts. The groom who died of a heart attack caused by an overdose of cantharidin became the knight slain by a succubus, a mythic figure whose death was ennobled by the supernatural. This recasting of events allowed the aristocracy to maintain the illusion of their own invulnerability, attributing their biological failings to cosmic forces rather than human frailty. In the cold light of historical analysis, the silence of the chronicles regarding these deaths is deafening, a deliberate void where the details of the death throes should be. We read of a duke who fell into a deep sleep and did not wake, or a prince who was seized by a sudden chill, euphemisms that cloaked the violent reality of neurotoxicity. The physicians of the time, if they were competent, surely knew the signs of atropine poisoning or cardiac arrest, but they also knew the value of their own heads. To diagnose the dead lord with an overdose of aphrodisiacs was to insult his memory and his manhood, a diagnosis that could easily lead the doctor to the same bonfire as the apothecary. Thus, the medical reality was suppressed, and the deaths were categorized under vague, acceptable headings that protected the fragile ego of the patriarchy. The courts of Europe were, in a sense, complicit in a massive, ongoing cover-up, a conspiracy of silence that allowed the dangerous practices to continue unchecked for centuries. Because the true cause of death was never officially acknowledged, the lesson was never learned, and the next generation of grooms would turn to the same deadly remedies, repeating the cycle of tragedy. The silence of the archives is not an absence of information, it is a presence of censorship, a thick velvet curtain drawn over the unpalatable truth. The ultimate tragedy of these fatal nights lies in the profound disconnection between the intent and the outcome, a gap bridged by lethal ignorance. These men did not want to die, they wanted desperately to create life, to secure their names, to fulfill the one duty that justified their existence and their privilege. They drank the poison not out of hedonism, but out of a crushing sense of obligation, believing they were taking a medicine that would ensure their future. That they died in the attempt, their hearts bursting from the very strain of trying to be the men their society demanded they be, is a sorrowful testament to the weight of the crown and the sword. As we look back at these unforgettable nights, we must see them not as amusing anecdotes of medieval ignorance, but as human tragedies fueled by immense social pressure. The young man foaming at the mouth on the banquet floor was not a fool, he was a victim of a world that valued his function over his life, a world that told him his worth was tied to a performance he could not guarantee. And so he took the powder, he drank the wine, and he paid the ultimate price, leaving behind a confused bride, a scorched apothecary, and a lie that would endure for 1,000 years. The wedding night, intended to be the genesis of a family, became instead the terminus of a life, a fatal collision between biology and expectation mediated by a few grains of deadly dust. Yet, the true and absolute horror of the medieval aphrodisiac trade is not found in the sudden silence of the grave, but in the agonizing ongoing existence of the survivors. While the grooms who died young were tragic figures, there is a far darker narrative belonging to those who swallowed the emerald green powder and lived to tell the tale, or rather, lived to hide the truth. These men were the consumers of the most infamous substance in the history of seduction, the crushed bodies of Lyda vesicatoria, the blister beetle known colloquially as Spanish fly. To understand their fate, one must realize that this was never a medicine in any benevolent sense, but a biological weapon deployed against the human body to force a reaction that nature had denied, a chemical coercion that came with a price tag paid in living tissue. The Spanish fly is a creature of deceptive beauty, an iridescent beetle that shimmers with the colors of a precious gem, creating a visual allure that medieval minds easily associated with value and potency. However, within its carapace lies a defense mechanism of terrifying efficiency, a toxic terpenoid called cantharidin. This substance does not interact with the brain's pleasure centers, nor does it affect the hormonal balance of the blood. It is a potent blistering agent, a vesicant designed by evolution to burn the mouths of predators. When a desperate groom ingested a potion laced with this ground insect, he was not swallowing liquid desire, he was swallowing a caustic acid that would begin a scorched earth campaign through his internal organs, a journey of destruction that would be misinterpreted as virility. As the toxin made its way through the digestive system, it was absorbed into the bloodstream and eventually filtered by the kidneys, which frantically attempted to expel the poison through the urinary tract. It was here, in the delicate mucous membranes of the urethra and the bladder, that the cantharidin did its most brutal work, acting like a chemical shredder on the cellular lining. The body's response to this acute injury was immediate and violent inflammation, a massive rush of blood and fluid to the groin in a desperate attempt to heal the chemical burns. This resulting engorgement and swelling mimicked the physical mechanics of an erection, but it was a deception of the cruelest magnitude, a structural parody of arousal built on a foundation of cellular necrosis. For the groom lying in the darkness of the bridal suite, the sensation was not the warm, rhythmic pulse of passion, but a searing, razor-sharp agony that radiated from his core. The desire he felt was actually the screaming of his own tissues as they ulcerated and bled, a constant, throbbing signal of biological distress that his brain was forced to reinterpret as sexual readiness. He was a man on the rack, yet the expectations of his family and the church demanded that he perform, forcing him to disconnect his mind from the signals of his body. He had to smile through clenched teeth, masking the fact that his unforgettable capability was actually a state of priapism induced by severe toxicological trauma, a condition where the blood is trapped and the tissue begins to suffocate. The act of consummation in such a state ceased to be an expression of intimacy and transformed into a gruesome endurance test, a mechanical function driven by pain rather than pleasure. Every movement would have sent fresh waves of burning agony through his inflamed system, turning the marriage bed into a private torture chamber where the groom was both the victim and the executioner. He was sacrificing the integrity of his own body for the sake of the lineage, using his phallus not as an organ of generation, but as a weapon of war that was backfiring in his hands. The tragedy was that he likely believed this pain was the necessary cost of manhood, a martial trial that proved his worthiness to lead, confusing the endurance of suffering with the capacity for love. This nightmare was not solitary. The toxicity of cantharidin is such that it can be passed through bodily fluids, meaning the bride was often an unwitting participant in this chemical burn. The fire of the wedding night, so often poeticized in the songs of troubadours, was for her a literal sensation of scorching heat as the blistering agent was transferred to her own delicate tissues. She would wake the next morning sore and inflamed, symptoms that the matrons and midwives would cheerfully interpret as evidence of her husband's formidable vigor and the success of the union. In reality, both husband and wife were victims of a shared poisoning, their union sealed not just by vows, but by the mutual destruction of their mucous membranes, a physical trauma that could leave the bride prone to infections and chronic pain for years. However, the most insidious cost was paid in silence by the groom in the days, months, and years that followed the triumph of the wedding night. The damage caused by cantharidin was rarely temporary. The aggressive ulceration often led to permanent scarring of the urinary tract, creating strictures that made the simple act of urination a daily ordeal of pain and difficulty. Worse still was the silent assault on the kidneys, the body's vital filters, which had been bombarded with a concentration of toxins they were never designed to handle. The successful groom often walked away from his wedding with the early stages of renal failure, a slow ticking clock that would shorten his life by decades. The historical record is filled with accounts of noblemen who suffered from bloody flux or mysterious stones in their middle age, euphemisms that likely masked the long-term sequelae of their youthful indiscretions with aphrodisiacs. These men would spend their remaining years in a state of low-level chronic illness, their complexion sallow and their energy sapped, as their compromised kidneys struggled to clear the blood of natural toxins. They had traded 40 years of health for 4 hours of chemically induced performance, a barter that seems insane to the modern mind but was viewed as a necessary rational calculation in a world where the survival of the name was the only form of immortality available. Consider the psychological toll on a man who knows that his heirs, the children playing in the castle courtyard, were conceived in a moment of excruciating torture. Every time he looked at his son, the future duke or king, he would be reminded of the night he bled from the inside to create him, a legacy inextricably linked to the memory of the emerald powder. This secret knowledge created a complex relationship with the concept of fatherhood and masculinity, reinforcing the grim medieval lesson that duty is suffering and that the needs of the bloodline supersede the needs of the flesh. The smile he wore in public was a mask of stoicism, hiding the fact that his internal geography had been permanently scorched by his desperate bid to avoid the shame of impotence. The use of Spanish fly also reveals a profound and disturbing truth about the medieval understanding of the body as a machine to be jump-started, regardless of the fuel used. Physicians and apothecaries treated the male reproductive system as a hydraulic engine that simply needed pressure to function, ignoring the complex interplay of emotion, health, and psychology. By bypassing the mind and attacking the tissue directly, they reduced the groom to a piece of livestock, forcing a biological reaction through chemical violence. It was a brutal, industrial approach to procreation that stripped the act of any humanity, treating the participants as mere conduits for the transmission of titles and lands. This practice also casts a shadow over the romanticized view of courtly love, revealing a subtext of desperate coercion that underpinned the glittering pageantry of the aristocracy. Behind the velvet curtains and the gold-embroidered sheets, there was often a man weeping silently as he passed blood into a chamber pot, terrified that the bleeding would never stop. The legendary stamina, recorded by gossipers, was actually the inability of the inflamed tissue to subside, a medical emergency that was applauded as a miracle. The groom was trapped in a performance he could not exit, forcing himself to continue the charade of virility even as his body screamed for mercy, a prisoner of his own anatomy. The long-term physiological consequences often included a complete destruction of natural function, rendering the user truly impotent once the damage healed into scar tissue. Thus, the cure often became the permanent cause of the disease, ensuring that the groom would need to rely on the powder again and again if he wished to father a spare to the heir. This created a cycle of dependency and escalating damage, where higher and higher doses were required to push through the accumulated scar tissue, accelerating the decline of the victim's health. It was a downward spiral of toxicity that frequently ended in the slow, agonizing death of kidney failure, a demise that was painful, drawn out, and completely preventable. Ultimately, the survival of the lineage was bought with the currency of human agony, proving that for the medieval consciousness, the abstract concept of the house was more real and valuable than the living person who led it. The groom was considered an expendable resource in the service of his own genealogy, a vessel to be used, broken, and discarded if necessary, provided the seed was planted before the end. The history of these dynasties is therefore written not just in ink and blood, but in canthariddin and scar tissue, a testament to the terrifying lengths to which humanity will go to deny the reality of weakness. As we look back on these practices, the comedy of the flying groom or the overeager lover dissolves into a tragedy of immense proportions, a story of young men tortured by their own expectations. The image that remains is not one of passion, but of a man gripping the bedsheets, his body burning with a chemical fire, praying for the dawn to release him from his duty. It serves as a grim reminder that in the high-stakes game of medieval power, love was often nothing more than a euphemism for endurance, and the price of a crown was often a life of quiet, secret suffering. In the final analysis, the emerald beetle is a fitting symbol for the era, beautiful on the surface, glittering with the promise of power and prestige, but toxic to the core. It teaches us that the past was a place where biology was an enemy to be vanquished, and where the most intimate moments of human life were militarized by the demand for succession. The unforgettable nights of the Middle Ages were indeed memorable, but they were etched into the mind by the searing point of a chemical burn, proving that for these men, the act of love felt exactly like the process of dying.